Something unprecedented is happening in American Christianity. For the first time in the nation's history, the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian has dropped below 65%. Churches that were once filled are now struggling to keep their doors open. Denominations that defined American religious life for centuries are watching their membership rolls shrink year after year. The numbers tell a stark story. In 1990, nearly 90% of Americans identified as Christian. Today, that number has fallen to around 63%. And it's declining by roughly 1% every year. If current trends continue, Christians could be a minority in America within the next 2 decades. But perhaps even more striking than those who are leaving are those who never arrive. Among Americans under 30, nearly 40% claim no religious affiliation at all. They're called knowns, not because they believe in nothing, but because when asked their religious preference, they check the box marked none. This isn't just about statistics. This represents millions of individual stories. People who were raised in the faith, who attended Sunday school and youth group, who were baptized and confirmed, and who at some point in their lives decided that Christianity was no longer for them. This documentary isn't about defending Christianity or attacking those who leave. It's about understanding. Because if we can't honestly examine why people are walking away, we can't have meaningful conversations about faith in 21st century America. Before we explore why people are leaving, we need to understand the scale of what's happening. The Pew Research Center has been tracking American religious affiliation for decades, and their data reveals a transformation that few predicted. In just one generation, from 2007 to 2021, the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian dropped from 78% to 63%. That's a loss of 15 percentage points in just 14 years. Meanwhile, those who identify as religiously unaffiliated, the knowns, have nearly doubled, rising from 16% to 29% over the same period. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. Not all Christian denominations are declining equally. Dr. Ryan Burge, composite character researcher. What we're seeing is a hollowing out of the middle. Mainline Protestant denominations, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, they've been in free fall for decades. They've lost 30 to 50% of their membership since the 1980s. Meanwhile, evangelical churches have been more stable, though they're now beginning to decline as well. The Catholic Church is holding relatively steady, but only because of Hispanic immigration. Among white Catholics, there's significant decline. The decline is also generational. Among Americans born before 1946, the silent generation, more than 80% still identify as Christian. Among baby boomers, it's around 70%. Generation X drops to about 65%. Millennials fall to 50%. And among Generation Z, the oldest of whom are now in their mid-20s, less than 45% identify as Christian. This isn't just people switching denominations. This is people leaving Christianity altogether, and increasingly, leaving religion entirely. Dr. Burge, what's particularly striking is that we're not seeing people replace Christianity with other religions. They're not becoming Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu in significant numbers. They're becoming nothing. They're saying, I don't need organized religion. I don't need institutional faith. I can construct my own sense of meaning and morality. This represents a fundamental shift in American culture. For most of American history, being Christian was simply part of being American. It was the default setting. Even people who rarely attended church still identified as Christian because that's what Americans did. But that cultural Christianity is collapsing. And the question is, why? What has changed? What is driving millions of Americans away from the faith that shaped this nation? If you ask people under 40 why they've left Christianity or never embraced it, one answer comes up again and again: politics. The fusion of conservative politics and evangelical Christianity over the past 40 years has been one of the most significant developments in American religious life. And for many people, especially younger Americans, it has made Christianity itself seem like a political movement rather than a spiritual path. Jennifer Chun, composite character, former evangelical. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical church, and somewhere along the way, I couldn't tell where Christianity ended and Republican politics began. Every sermon seemed to mention abortion or gay marriage or traditional values. I started to feel like being a Christian meant signing up for a specific political agenda. And when I couldn't agree with that agenda anymore, I felt like I had to leave the church entirely. The marriage between evangelical Christianity and conservative politics began in earnest in the late 1970s with the formation of the moral majority. Leaders like Jerry Falwell mobilized Christians around issues like abortion, school prayer, and opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. Over the following decades, being evangelical became increasingly synonymous with being politically conservative. By 2016, when 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump despite his personal history and behavior that seemed at odds with Christian values, many people, especially young people, felt a sense of betrayal or confusion. Marcus Johnson, composite character, millennial nun. I watched Christians I respected defend things that seemed completely contrary to what Jesus taught. The tribalism, the nationalism, the hostility toward immigrants and refugees. I kept asking myself, is this what Christianity is really about? And eventually I decided it wasn't for me. Now, it's important to note that not all Christians are politically conservative, and not all who leave Christianity do so for political reasons. There are thriving, progressive Christian communities. Many Christians actively work for social justice, racial equality, and care for the poor, values they see as central to the gospel. But the public face of American Christianity, the Christianity that dominates media coverage and cultural perception, has been overwhelmingly conservative and political. And for many people, particularly younger Americans who hold progressive views on issues like LGBTQ rights, climate change, and racial justice, that political Christianity feels incompatible with their values. Dr. Sarah Martinez, composite character, theologian. The tragedy is that Christianity becomes reduced to a set of political positions rather than the radical, transformative message of Jesus. When the church is primarily known for what it's against rather than who it's for, when it's associated more with political power than with serving the marginalized, it's not surprising that people walk away. This political dimension doesn't exist in isolation. It intersects with other factors that have pushed people away from Christianity. But it's impossible to understand the current exodus without recognizing how the entanglement of faith and politics has alienated millions of Americans who might otherwise have remained in the church. Talk to people who have left Christianity, and you'll often hear stories about exclusion. About being told they weren't welcome, or that people they loved weren't welcome, or that who they were was incompatible with being a Christian. The treatment of LGBTQ individuals by many Christian churches has been particularly significant in driving people away. Michael Rodriguez, composite character, gay former Christian. I knew I was gay from the time I was 12 years old. I also loved Jesus. I loved my church. I read my Bible. I prayed every day. But I kept hearing that being gay meant I was sinful, broken, an abomination. I tried to change. I prayed for years to be different. And when that didn't work, when I finally accepted that this was who I was, I had to choose between my faith and my authentic self. And I chose myself. Michael's story is not unique. Research shows that attitudes toward LGBTQ individuals are one of the strongest predictors of whether young people will remain in or leave Christianity. A 2021 survey found that 47% of LGBTQ millennials who were raised Christian have left the faith, significantly higher than the general population. But it's not just LGBTQ individuals themselves who are leaving. It's their friends, their siblings, their allies. When young people see their gay friends excluded or condemned by the church, they often conclude that the church doesn't represent the love and acceptance they believe Christianity should embody. Amanda Peterson, composite character straight ally. My best friend came out as lesbian when we were in high school, and I watched how our church treated her. The whispers, the judgment, the people who said they'd pray for her struggle. It was cruel. And I thought, if this is how Christians treat someone I love, someone who's kind and good and just wants to be herself, then I don't want to be part of it. The issue extends beyond LGBTQ inclusion. Many people have left Christianity because of experiences with racism in the church. Black Christians have long noted the segregation of American Christianity. Martin Luther King Jr. famously called Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America. That remains largely true today. When white churches fail to address systemic racism, when they remain silent on police brutality or voter suppression, when they prioritize comfort over justice, many people, particularly young people of color, feel that the church has abandoned the prophetic voice of the gospel. Dr. James Washington, composite character pastor. The church should be leading the way on issues of justice and inclusion. We follow a Jesus who reached out to the excluded, who challenged religious authorities, who said the last shall be first. When the church instead becomes a place of exclusion and judgment, we're betraying the very gospel we claim to follow. It's worth noting that some Christians and denominations have become more inclusive, affirming LGBTQ members and ordaining women and people of color to leadership. The Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, and others have moved toward full inclusion. But these moves have often come too late for those who have already left. And they've sometimes caused division within denominations, with more conservative members leaving to form new, more traditional congregations. The question of inclusion, who is welcome, who is excluded, whose humanity is fully affirmed, has become one of the defining tensions in American Christianity. And many people, unable to reconcile their values with what they see in the church, have simply walked away. Politics and exclusion explain much of why people leave Christianity, but there's another factor that's often quieter but equally powerful: intellectual doubt. For many people, especially those raised in more conservative or fundamentalist traditions, there comes a moment when the beliefs they were taught begin to conflict with what they're learning about the world. Daniel Kim, composite character, former fundamentalist. I was raised to believe that the Bible was literally true in every detail. Six-day creation, a young earth, Noah's flood covering the entire planet, Jonah being swallowed by a whale. When I got to college and started studying biology and geology, I couldn't reconcile what I was learning with what my church had taught me. And when I asked questions, I was told I just needed more faith, that science was wrong, that I was being deceived by secular humanism. The tension between certain interpretations of Christianity and modern science has created a crisis of faith for many people. When churches teach that evolution is false, that the earth is only 6,000 years old, that climate change is a hoax, they put people in an impossible position: reject science or reject faith. For many educated Americans, that choice is not difficult. They choose science. And in doing so, They often leave Christianity behind entirely, unable to separate the fundamentalist interpretation from Christianity itself. Dr. Martinez. The tragedy is that Christianity and science don't have to be in conflict. Many of the founders of modern science were Christians. Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, is a devout Christian. There are ways to read Genesis that don't require rejecting evolution. But when churches insist on literal readings and make those readings a test of faith, they push people away unnecessarily. Beyond science, there are philosophical and theological questions that lead people to doubt. The problem of suffering. How can a loving, all-powerful God allow such terrible evil and pain in the world? The exclusivity of salvation. Do sincere Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus really go to hell? The contradictions and difficult passages in the Bible. How do we make sense of texts that seem to endorse slavery, genocide, or the subjugation of women? Jennifer Chun. I started reading the Bible more carefully as an adult. Not just the comforting verses, but the whole thing. And there were passages that deeply troubled me. God ordering the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child in Canaan. Rules about slavery. Paul telling women to be silent in church. My pastor would say we need to understand the cultural context, but at a certain point I thought, if we're picking and choosing which parts to follow based on cultural context, who's to say any of it is divinely inspired? These intellectual struggles are often compounded by a church culture that discourages questioning. In many Christian communities, doubt is seen as weakness or lack of faith, rather than a natural part of spiritual growth. When people can't ask hard questions without being dismissed or condemned, they often stop asking the questions in church and start looking for answers elsewhere. The internet has also changed the landscape of doubt. In previous generations, a person with questions might only hear their pastor's perspective. Today, they can read scholarly arguments for and against Christianity, listen to debates, hear from former believers explaining why they left. Information that was once difficult to access is now available instantly. Dr. Birch. The internet has democratized doubt. You no longer have to be a scholar to access the arguments against Christianity. You can find thoughtful, well-articulated critiques from former believers, from atheist philosophers, from biblical scholars who've lost their faith. And once you're exposed to those arguments, it's hard to unhear them. We need to address something painful but essential to understanding why people are leaving Christianity. The church's failures, the scandals, the hypocrisy, the abuse. The sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church has been devastating, not just for survivors but for Catholics worldwide who've watched their church protect predators rather than children. Thousands of priests abused tens of thousands of children over decades, and church leadership systematically covered it up, moving abusive priests from parish to parish rather than reporting them to authorities. But sexual abuse and cover-ups haven't been limited to Catholic churches. In recent years, massive abuse scandals have rocked Southern Baptist churches, independent evangelical churches, and other denominations. High-profile pastors and church leaders have been revealed as abusers, manipulators, and frauds. Lisa Thompson, composite character, abuse survivor. I was sexually abused by a youth pastor when I was 15. When I finally told church leadership, they didn't believe me. They said I was trying to destroy a good man's reputation. They sent him to another church where he abused more girls. For years, I blamed myself, and I stayed away from church because it was too painful, too triggering. The institution that was supposed to protect me instead protected my abuser. Beyond sexual abuse, there have been financial scandals. Megachurch pastors living in mansions and flying private jets while preaching prosperity gospel to struggling congregations. There have been revelations about church leaders having affairs, living double lives, engaging in the very behaviors they condemned from the pulpit. Each scandal erodes trust. Each act of hypocrisy reinforces the perception that Christianity is about power and control rather than genuine faith and transformation. Marcus Johnson. I watched so-called Christian leaders get caught in scandal after scandal. Affairs, financial fraud, abuse. And then they'd cry on TV, ask for forgiveness, and 6 months later they'd be back in the pulpit. Meanwhile, ordinary people in the congregation were judged harshly for far lesser things. The hypocrisy was staggering. The institutional failures extend beyond individual scandals. Many people have left Christianity because of how churches have handled or failed to handle systemic issues. The church's response to the COVID-19 pandemic alienated many people. Some churches defied public health guidance, held maskless indoor services, and spread conspiracy theories about vaccines. Others struggled to transition online and lost members who discovered they didn't miss church as much as they thought they would. The racial reckoning of 2020 following George Floyd's murder revealed deep divides within American Christianity. While some churches embraced conversations about racial justice and systemic racism, many white churches remained silent or actively pushed back against these discussions. Black Christians and their allies often felt abandoned by churches that claimed to follow a Jesus who sided with the oppressed. Dr. Washington. The church should have been leading on racial justice. Instead, in many cases, we've been dragging our feet or actively resisting. When the culture is more prophetic than the church, when secular movements are doing more to pursue justice than the people of God, something has gone terribly wrong. Narrator. Beyond specific failures or controversies, there's a broader cultural shift happening that helps explain why people are leaving Christianity. A shift toward prioritizing authenticity, individual experience, and personal spirituality over institutional religion. Modern Americans, particularly younger generations, are deeply skeptical of institutions generally. Trust in government, media, corporations, and yes, religious institutions has declined significantly over the past several decades. People are less likely to automatically defer to authority or tradition. At the same time, there's been a cultural shift toward authenticity and personal truth. The idea that you should conform to institutional expectations or suppress your true self for the sake of fitting in feels increasingly unacceptable. People want to be authentic, to live in alignment with their values, to construct meaning on their own terms. Amanda Peterson. My parents' generation went to church because that's what you did. It was part of being respectable, being a good person, being normal. But my generation doesn't operate that way. We want things to be meaningful, authentic. If church doesn't resonate with us, if it feels like we're just going through the motions, we stop going. We're not going to pretend to believe something just because we're supposed to. This doesn't necessarily mean people are becoming less spiritual. Many who leave Christianity describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. They meditate, practice yoga, read philosophy, seek meaning and connection, just not within institutional Christianity. Dr. Martinez. What we're seeing is a shift from inherited religion to chosen spirituality. Previous generations received their religious identity from their families and communities. You were born Catholic or Baptist or Lutheran, and that's what you remained. But today's generations want to choose their own path. They want spirituality that feels personally meaningful rather than simply traditional. For some, this journey leads away from Christianity entirely. For others, it leads to progressive Christian communities that emphasize justice, inclusion, and doubt as part of faith. Still others construct their own personal spirituality, drawing from Christianity, Buddhism, secular philosophy, and their own experiences. The rise of the knowns doesn't mean America is becoming atheist. Many knowns believe in God or some higher power. They pray occasionally. They consider spiritual questions. They just don't see institutional Christianity as necessary or helpful for their spiritual lives. So why are Americans leaving Christianity? There's no single answer. It's politics and exclusion and intellectual doubt and scandal and cultural shifts. It's the gap between the radical love of Jesus and the judgmental behavior of some Christians. It's churches that feel more interested in maintaining power than serving people. It's teachings that conflict with science and values that conflict with justice. But here's what's important. This isn't primarily a story about Christianity failing. It's a story about a specific expression of Christianity, often institutional, often conservative, often culturally embedded, losing its hold on American culture. Christianity has survived and thrived through countless transformations over 2 millennia. It has adapted to different cultures, different eras, different challenges. This moment, as painful as it may be for churches watching their pews empty, may be another transformation. Some Christians see this exodus as a crisis. Others see it as an opportunity, a chance to strip away cultural Christianity and return to something more authentic, more focused on the radical teachings of Jesus rather than maintaining institutional power. The question for American Christianity isn't whether it will survive. It will. The question is what form it will take. Will it continue to decline as it clings to positions and practices that alienate younger generations? Or will it transform, finding ways to speak to people's deepest needs for meaning, community, and justice? For those who have left Christianity, many express not anger but sadness. They often wish they could have stayed. They miss the community, the sense of purpose, the spiritual practices. But they couldn't reconcile what they experienced in church with what they believed about love, justice, truth, and authenticity. Understanding why people leave isn't about blame. It's about honesty. And perhaps in that honesty, in listening to the stories of those who've walked away, Christianity can find a path forward, one that honors both ancient faith and modern questions, that balances truth and love, that welcomes doubt as part of the journey rather than evidence of failure. The exodus from American Christianity is real. The question is, what comes next?